my Polina pullover now? And why have I restarted? So to walk you through this, I think that I'm going to first remind you of where I was with the garment last time, show you kind of version number 1, and I'll pop that on and talk about the issues that I noticed with it, the kind of sinking feeling that I had, and then I kept knitting for a while with that sinking feeling, why I ultimately decided to restart, and what changes I made. So this is version number 1. I did block it because the concern that I had was about fit and yoke depth. And in my experience, certainly with these swatches, but really with my experience across the board, I know that my knitting, when I block it, always kind of scooches up. I always lose a bit of length, and my stitches settle out and I gain a little bit in my stitch count. I get this information because I always measure my swatches both before and after I block them, and I find it really helpful just to have a kind of reminder, some numbers to go back to see what, what proportion are things shifting in and in what direction are things shifting when I block them. So I have blocked this to get a kind of more final idea of whether or not this was going to be a deal breaker for me, and unfortunately it was. Last time I spoke with you, I believe that I was about 3/4 of the way through this yoke, 3/4 of the way through the motif. So as you can see, I finished the motif and I did the second round of short rows. In this pattern, you do 1 round of short rows, a set of short rows as part of the neck ribbing, and then you do a set of short rows after that first motif. So you can see that there's a lot more main color here at the back of the garment than there is at the front of the garment, where we really end right at that motif. So let me pop this on and show you the issue I had with yoke depth. And it was close, which was a bit heartrending. I felt like, it was so close. But the issue that I had is that even once it's blocked and all fitted and laying flat, I can't even pinch this under my underarm. That's the best way to show this to you. I apologize, I'm wearing a dark shirt, which I didn't really think of, but you can see the tips of my fingers there. It's not meeting under my arm. If I really tug on it, it can meet under my arm, but even that really, to me, is just way too tight, right? You will be casting on more stitches in the pattern as you split for sleeves, but the kind of best practice guidance that I've been able to source is that you really want to have at least an inch, 2.5 centimeters, after the actual divide between your arm and your body and the divide between the arm and the body of your sweater. So you want an inch between your actual armpit and the armpit of your garment. Just because we move when we wear garments, you don't want to just have to sit like this the whole time. You want to be able to reach, to bend, to be comfortable. Also, just for me, the idea of having wool right up in my armpits makes me feel a bit claustrophobic. I want a bit more room than that. I knew that this would just not be comfortable. Now, Teddy Lutzak does account for the fact that some people might run into this issue in the pattern itself. All sorts of things are going to affect what kind of yoke depth you might need, right? So I might have run into this problem even if I was knitting on gauge. I think that my issue is my gauge, but I might have run into this issue otherwise. Bust size is going to affect how deep of a yoke you need, right? Because it will be bringing the dimension out as well as down. So if you have a sizable bust, you might need a slightly deeper yoke than other people. If you have a smaller bust, you might need not quite as much depth before you reach that kind of acceptable place to divide for sleeves. One thing that I really didn't take into account with this pattern, and that I feel silly about not taking into account because she gave us the information, but I didn't take my height into account in terms of yoke depth. I mentioned before that Teddy Lutzak is considerate enough to share her bust and her height dimensions on her project pages, which I think is so, so helpful. The more information that a designer gives us, the better. And Teddy Lutzak is quite a bit shorter than I am. She shares that she is 160 centimeters, or about 5'3", and I am 5'8", so about 173 centimeters. You can find standardized body measurements, kind of averaged body measurements for big populations online, and these can be really helpful. So I did go and consult some of this that I have saved. I have it in a book, but I will link some of this below for you. But I went and consulted, and The measurement here on our body doesn't vary wildly based on our height. The changes tend to be fairly slight, but when we're talking of a difference of 13 centimeters or 5 inches, that might have been enough to change, my requirement for a yoke depth, even if I'd been bang on row gauge. So Teddy Lutzak knows that based on different bodies, based on different heights, this might be an issue. And what she suggests is that you just keep knitting in plain main color. So you just do whatever width of band of main color you need to get the yoke to a place where you feel comfortable splitting for sleeves. She also, I think with something that shows quite a bit of forethought, she suggests that if that's what you do, you keep track of the exact number of rows that you do that with so that you can balance it out on the other side of the kind of dotted line that she puts right at the split for sleeves so that you can balance it out underneath. This would have been a perfectly fine solution to this issue, and really, the reason that I had a hard time emotionally deciding, the reason I had a bit of a, should I do this or should I not do this, about deciding to cast on and start from scratch, is because she offers a solution right there, and that could have worked fine. The reason I decided not to do that, though, is really because part of what I love about this pattern so much is the way that those two colorwork motifs, the one on the yoke and the one after you split for sleeves on the torso, the way that they meet at the front. That's part of what made me fall in love with this pattern, and I think I would have been sad if, just for the sake of not having to reknit this, I gave up on the opportunity to at least try and fix that, to try and address that issue and make it look more the way that I had anticipated. So let me pop on my second try, and I'm gonna stop the camera to do this because it's gonna be more awkward and take more time, and you just don't need to watch that. So let me pop on my restart and show you exactly what changes I made. Okay, so this is my second attempt, and I am so happy with it. I'm so glad I restarted. I'm so glad that I decided to make even just the small changes that I made and hope that they would be enough, because they really have been. So let me walk you through what I've done. The first and kind of silliest modification that I made is that I did the ribbing with a different size of needle. If you joined me in the first video where I talked about the Polina pullover, you may have caught that even though I went up a needle size from Teddy Lutzak's pattern on the body and knit the body in a 3.75 millimeter needle instead of a 3.5 millimeter needle, as she calls for, in the ribbing I used the exact needle she called for. I used a 3 millimeter needle. Normally, if I'm sizing up here, I would also size up for the ribbing and use a 3.25 millimeter needle. And the reason that I didn't do that, I didn't address this in the last video, but the reason I didn't do that was pure laziness. I didn't have a 3.25 millimeter needle on hand. I was packing up the project to go to London unexpectedly, and I just didn't want to delay things by having to make my way to a yarn store or order in a needle and wait for it to arrive. So I just decided to cast on with a 3 millimeter needle and hoped it would be okay. I have in the past decided to knit with a smaller needle for the collar. In my bighorn sweater, for example, I use a smaller needle for the neck ribbing than I do for the cuff or bottom ribbing. And I do that deliberately sometimes because I like quite tight crew neck. I like a tight weave at the neck to really bring the crew neck in around my neck and give the garment a bit more integrity, make for slightly tighter stitches that are going to be holding onto the weight of the rest of the sweater. I would love to tell you that that was the decision process that I used for using a 3 millimeter needle the first go around, but it really wasn't. It was just laziness and not having one available. So the first change that I made when I restarted was, while version number 1 was blocking, I did make my way out to a yarn shop and get a 3.25 millimeter needle so that I could cast on with the appropriate needle. The next change that I made, because of row gauge and because of seeing how version 1 blocked out, was that I added on 4 rows to the first section of the ribbing. So in the neck, it's a bit of a dark yarn, but I don't know if you can see that the neck ribbing is kind of made up of 3 sections. The first section, which stands up and flares out, the second section which pulls in, and then the third section which flares out and begins your yoke, really. I wanted this to stand up a little bit more than it did, so I added in 4 rows to what the pattern called for in this first section, just to give myself a bit more lift, because I think this is so pretty. So 4 rows there. That has nothing to do with fit, that was just aesthetic choice. I also added in 2 rows to section 3. So right at the end of section 3, I did 2 more rows in the pattern that she had established to start dropping the yoke down a little bit. I don't think this is going to have made a huge difference because the yoke is so cinched in, but at this point I was thinking every little counts. The biggest modification that I made, though, was to the motif itself. And the way that I did this was probably a bit analog, and there are probably faster or smarter ways to do this, I don't know. But what I really did was I just pulled up the motif from the Polina pullover on one side of my screen, and I pulled up an Excel spreadsheet which I had made so that it was squares instead of rectangles, and I really did just 1 square at a time make the motif for myself so that I could play around with it. I then added in 7 extra rows. And the way that I arrived at 7 extra rows was kind of twofold. One, I did some playing around and just kind of saw how many rows can I add in before the motif starts looking quite different to me. How many rows can I add in where I'm still happy with the motif and don't think that my changes will show too much. But I was also doing the kind of math that I walked you through in one of those previous videos, right? So 7 is what I arrived at, so let's talk about that math in terms of 7 rows. So I'm going to use the same formula, but instead of putting my stitch gauge, I'm going to put my row gauge. And my row gauge was 30 rows per 4 inches. So on one side of my formula, I'm going to have 30 rows over 4 inches. And on the other side, I'm going to have 7 stitches over x, where we're solving for x. So, like before, I multiply across the equal sign and I divide moving vertically. So 7 stitches times 4 inches divided by 30 stitches. And that gave me 0.9 inches. We could also add in the 2 rows from the ribbing section here if we wanted to. So then we would be looking at 9 additional rows instead of 7, and the formula would stay otherwise the same. So we've got 9 stitches times 4 inches divided by 30 stitches gives me 1.2 inches. Since version number 1 was stopping right at my natural armpit, 1.2 inches I thought was going to be bang on. That's just about perfect. Where I added in my extra rows, in case this is the kind of thing that you think you might want to do with the same exact pattern, though I think that this could apply to other motifs as well, is I added in 1 extra row, 1 extra round into the flower, 1 extra round into the first section of stem between the flower and the first set of leaves, 1 row into the first set of leaves, another into this second section of stem, so between the 2 sets of leaves, another row into the second section of leaves, and then I added 2 stitches, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yes, 2 stitches. I added 2 more rows onto the bottom section of stem, so just to really drop that down a little bit. And I'm so happy with that. I think that it has worked out exactly as I expected. I've probably got closer to 1.5 or maybe even just over 1.5 inches there, but I haven't blocked this yet. As you can see, it's very wrinkly and not lying flat yet. So I know, based on my swatch, based also on version number 1, which I blocked, I know that this will scooch up a little bit when I block it and relax out a little bit. So I will lose a little bit of that length, but I have really, I have more like 1.5 inches, maybe even 2 inches here. So I will end up with 1.2 inches once it's blocked, and that will be just perfect. One other change that I was thinking of making, and that I wanted to mention just because I think it is something that other people could do if they were running into similar issues, is that the pattern has you do 1 round of main color, then you divide for sleeves on this kind of dotted line motif, right, where you've got 1 contrast color stitch and then 2 main color stitches around. When I first read this, I kind of thought, well, that's kind of strange. Why are you dividing for sleeves on a patterned row? Because that's just going to complicate your life unnecessarily. And I also thought that I could get an extra row of depth by doing one row, main color, then doing the pattern stitch all the way around, and then dividing for sleeves on the main color row after this patterned row. And then you would be dividing for sleeves on a main color row. I think that this could be a helpful thing to do if you are looking for every little bit counts. If you want to drop your yoke down just a little bit more before you divide for sleeves, that could be a good option. But I'm actually really glad that I decided not to. And the reason that I decided not to is that Teddy Litzak links to a video for the technique she has you use to cast on stitches in this patterned row. And I've linked that video below actually because I just think that it is so cool. So because she has you using both strands, both the main color and the contrast color in that round, instead of having you do backward loop for the casting on those stitches, she has you do the long tail cast on, which maybe this is something some of you have come across before. I don't think I would ever have thought about this, and I just think that it is so clever because it gives you, right? So you end up using the contrast color as a kind of base, and all of the stitches that you cast on are in the main color, but it just has a bit more stretch than a backward loop method, and it's got a bit more integrity, right? It's going to be a bit stronger at that section of the body because the long tail cast on uses 2 threads instead of 1 and is just a bit stronger than a backwards loop cast on. So I'm really glad. I think that was worth losing out on 1 extra row of depth. I've got enough depth now, so that was worth losing out on that just to have that extra bit of fun, I guess, there, doing something new for the first time and giving the garment a bit more integrity. One final thing that I think is worth noting when we're talking about making the modifications up here is that, and this didn't occur to me right away, but is that that's going to change the proportion between the main motif and any other motifs that you have in your garment, right? All of a sudden, this is 7 stitches longer than it was meant to be. So I did add in some additional rows to this motif as well, though fewer, just to try to balance out that change in proportion a little bit. I did not think about this right away. If I had thought about it right away, I probably would have added in some extra stitches to that first bit of stem in this motif. I didn't think about it until I was starting the leave, and then I thought, ooh, this might end up shorter, it might end up looking a bit weird. So what I did, I just added in 2 extra rows to this, so not a big change, but I added in 1 extra row to each section of stem. So I didn't change any of the leaves or the flower in this case, but I think that it's worked out just fine. And here, I'll scooch forward so that you can see a bit more. So that is the proportion that I've ended up with, and I'm happy with that. I have no issues with that. I think it's going to look just fine in the finished garment. So that, I believe, is everything that I had to share with you about the Polina pullover and the saga of knitting that I have been having with it. I do hope that some of this was useful for you. I will, of course, be coming back and talking about the Polina pullover in probably a more ordinary numbered episode next time. So I'll let you know if any further adventures present themselves, but for the most part, I think that I've done all of the thinking and all of the math for this sweater. The rest of it should be pretty straightforward, and it's going to give me a garment that I'm really happy with, that is at a gauge and a size between sizes, so that I end up with something that fits me a bit better and suits my life a bit more. I do hope that these videos have been helpful for you, and again, if you have any thoughts about doing any of this differently, or if you have any questions, please do feel free to share any of that below. I am no expert, but I will do my absolute best to help in any way that I can. So thanks again. Happy knitting. Happy adventurous knitting. I hope that at the very least, even if you're not interested in knitting off gauge, I hope that this encourages you to make modifications in other ways. I think that the braver we are with our knitting, the more likely we are, maybe after a bit of frogging and a bit of frustration, to end up with garments that really suit us and that really fit the way that we want to. So I will leave you with that. Happy adventurous knitting, and I hope to talk to you soon.